Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of A God Worth Knowing. And today's lecture I titled The Most Important Prophecy in the Bible. So I just want to do a little recap before we start with this study. So the things that we have studied before is, first of all, can we trust the Bible? And we saw some clear prophetic proof why the Bible can be trusted. Then we saw the big theme of the great controversy and the battle between good and evil and how it started and why evil exists here on the planet today, and how that conflict in heaven was eventually translated to earth and is continued on since then. And we have seen that the book of Daniel and Revelation really reveals the plan of Satan, and our goal is to see how God has worked throughout history and especially to see what we can expect in the end of time. So I just want to do a little review of the prophecies that we have studied so far, some important timelines. So if we look at Daniel chapter 7, the things that we saw there, that great timeline, was that there were different kings that would come before Jesus would eventually come back to planet Earth and rescue us. First of all, we saw that the nation of Babylon would come, then Medo-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, then eventually papal Rome that would rule for 1260 years, and he would receive a wound in 1798 by the French Revolution. And the next thing in the timeline of Daniel chapter 7 is a great judgment scene in heaven, where we can see that the Son of Man will come to the Ancient of Days, which is the Father, and there will be a time period of judgment before Jesus, he will receive the kingdom, and we clearly proved it, that he will receive his kingdom and then to return. This we can read in Luke chapter 19. So the judgment scene in heaven, it's not Jesus' second coming, as some people have misunderstood. And the vision basically ends there. And then before we went into Daniel chapter 8, we wanted to study another interesting timeline related to the Hebrew sanctuary. Because the Hebrew sanctuary was given to the Jews in order for them to understand heavenly things. This is clear from Hebrews chapter 8, that this was a pattern that they would have to follow in order to understand what Jesus would do in heaven. First of all, as the sacrifice on earth, as the Passover lamb, and then eventually his ministry as a high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. And we had this timeline or milestones that we could see in the Jewish feast days. We saw the Passover, which represented Jesus' death, the unleavened bread, which would represent Jesus' burial, and the first fruits, which happened on the third day after the Passover, which would be Jesus' resurrection. And then 50 days later, there would be the Feast of Harvest or Pentecost. And this represented, of course, we know that the Holy Spirit was outpoured on this day, but what happened in heaven, what we had studied before, was that Jesus, he was anointed as a high priest on that day. And then we figured out that there are still some feasts that have not been fulfilled. The Feast of Tabernacles has not yet been fulfilled, because this is related to the second coming and when we will be in heaven. So we reason that we must live somewhere either in the Feast of Harvest, Trumpets, or the Day of Atonement. And that is why we studied this before we went into Daniel chapter 8. Because Daniel chapter 8 is the only chapter that, or even only verse in Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, that reveals when the Day of Atonement would start, when the sanctuary would be cleansed. And that is what we had studied before. And again, we got this timeline in Daniel chapter 8, and it followed Daniel chapter 7 very, very well. But here it starts in the time of the Medes and the Persians, then onto Greece, and then Greece will be divided into 4 kingdoms, and then the pagan Roman kingdom would come, and eventually when armies was given to the papacy, it also became the next ruling kingdom. And then came this great question, how long will this go on in Daniel chapter 13? And the answer is given until 2,300 days or evening and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Basically the start of the Day of Atonement, because the sanctuary was cleansed only on the Day of Atonement. And then the problem in Daniel chapter 8 was that Gabriel, he had come to give Daniel skill and understanding of the vision, of the mare, if you remember, a particular part of the vision, the 2,300 days. But Daniel very clearly states in the end of chapter 8 that he didn't understand the 2,300 days or the vision of the evening and the mornings. So did Gabriel really accomplish his mission there in Daniel chapter 8? Not really. That is why in Daniel chapter 9, some years later, who comes back to Daniel to give him skill and understanding? It's Gabriel. And I hope you can see that Daniel chapter 9 is actually not a vision. It's actually a commentary, a continuation, because Daniel, he got sick and couldn't bear anymore. So Gabriel, he comes back and is now supposed to give him skill and understanding of the 2,300 days. And the first thing he starts with is to say, I have come to give you understanding. And then he says that 70 weeks are for your people. 490 years are for your people, which are cut off from the great prophecy, the 2,300 days. And we got eventually a starting point, a starting date, when the commandment was given to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which was in 457 BC. So then we could clearly see in the last episode that we saw that the 70 weeks is a clear prediction of when the Messiah would come, when he would be anointed, like with his baptism, when he would die in the middle of the week, and then eventually when these years of probation for the Jewish people ended with the stoning of Stephen in 34 AD. So it just fit perfectly. And this was a part of the 2,300 days. So there still remains 1,810 days. So we have to add this to 34 AD to see where we end up if we complete this whole history. And we can see that these 70 weeks fit perfectly with history. And then we can expect that the rest of the 2,300 days will also end up in a particular date, which would be 1844. And that is what we want to study today. What happened there then? And what did it mean that the sanctuary would be cleansed, or the start of the Day of Atonement? So before we actually study these things, I want to prove to you that this prophecy of the 2,300 days is one of the most important prophecies in the Bible. So let me prove that to you. So if we turn to Daniel chapter 12, in the end of book of Daniel, we can see that after you have received all the visions and explanations, somebody, an angel, comes to him and tells him this in verse 4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. So Daniel, his commandment to close the book, the things that he have seen, and we'll see what was closed. But how long would the book of Daniel how long would it be closed according to this verse? Until the time of the end. And then we read, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. What is this a reference to? Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. I heard some preachers tell that this is talking about that the future development of automobiles and traveling, that people will be able in the future to run to and fro. But that is not what this verse is telling us. Because if you go to Amos chapter 8 and verse 12, what does it mean to run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased? Amos chapter 8 and verse 12 says this, and they shall wander from sea to sea, and from north even to the east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it. So to run to and fro is related to seeking the word of the Lord, or the word of God. So the word of God would be increased after the time of the end. Let us continue reading in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 5 to 10. This is very important, as we will see. So then Daniel, he will see two men at the river, next to the bank of the river. So what it says here in verse 5, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on the side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? Basically what he's asking, how long will it be till the time of the end? Because that is when the book of Daniel would be opened, right? Let us read verse 7. And I heard the man clothed in linen. Remember these words because we'll see this picked up in Revelation later. And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, that it shall be for time, times, and half a time. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And we know a little bit what this prophecy is related to, the time, times, and half a time. We read it in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, relating to the ruling of the papacy from 538 to 1798. Let us continue. Verse 8. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are, again emphasized, the words of Daniel, they are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So the book of Daniel, and what does it mean that the book of Daniel would be sealed? Does it mean that, or shut up, that it couldn't be open for so many thousand years? It means that it could not be understood. But after the time of the end, it would be understood. So the great question for us to ask is, when does the time of the end start? It seems like there's a specific date for that. Let us also read verse 10, because this is important. After the time of the end, after the book of Daniel will be opened, what will happen? Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. We can see here that the people of God will understand the book of Revelation, and we'll see what particular part. But let us now ask the question, is there a way to understand when the time of the end started? Is there a clear Bible verse? Because this is what they asked, and it seemed that it was related to these 1,260 years. But I think there's even a clearer way to prove when the time of the end starts. If we just turn to the prophecy, eventually we will study Daniel chapter 11, but I will just show you a clear part from there. And we have basically studied this in Daniel chapter 7. If we go to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 33 and read till 36, we will see when the time of the end starts. There it says, And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Here it talks about a particular time of persecution that the people of God will go through. And it is the king of the north that will persecute them. So let us find out who this king of the north is and how long he would persecute the people of God. Let us continue verse 34. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries, and some of them of understanding, this is a reference to the people of God because they will understand, shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white. And now comes the question, how long were they to fall by the sword? How long were they to be persecuted? It says here, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. The book of Daniel clearly points out that there is a particular time when the time of the end will start. And it says that the people of the God would be persecuted till the time of the end. So if we can figure out who was it that persecuted them and how long was this historical figure persecuting the people of God, we might know when the time of the end starts. Let us go to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 36. And we will compare this to something we have read before. There we read, And the king, talking about the king of the north who is persecuting the people of God here, shall do according to his will. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. A clear appointed time. And doesn't this description ring a bell from something? Somebody who would exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, speak marvelous things against God, and persecute the people of God? A clear reference to Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, where we read about the little horn, the papacy power that would persecute the people of God for how long? It says here, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints, persecute them, of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand. How long would he persecute them? Until a time and times and dividing, or half a time. So it's clear that when this persecution ends, when this time prophecy ends, that is when the time of the end starts. And we know that these 1,260 years, a day for a year, if you are a bit confused what I'm talking about here, you have to listen to the lectures before. This should not be the first lecture that you have listened to, hopefully. And we can see that after 1798, after these 1,260 years are fulfilled, when the papacy got its armies and its power, when state united with the church, 538, when they got this power, and eventually when it was taken away from them by Napoleon in 1798, exactly 1,260 years, but that is when the time of the end would start. And why was it important to understand when the time of the end would start? Because that is when the book of Daniel would be opened, or to be understood. And you can see here on the picture that 1798 could basically be called the date when the time of the end would start. So if we go back to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4, we clearly read there that, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. So the question arises, was everything in the book of Daniel sealed? Was everything in the book of Daniel not to be understood? I mean, chapter 1 is not that difficult to understand. Daniel and his friends, they're eating vegetables and they are healthy, and I don't think there's a spiritual hidden meaning in that necessarily. Or Daniel in the lion's den, we can't understand that. Or even Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2. Many people, even the Protestant reformers, understood a lot about these things. And even the church fathers understood a lot of Daniel chapter 7. But what particular part was it that was sealed or shut up till the time of the end that could not be understood before that time? Let us turn to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 26, if you remember. There we read, and the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, talking about the vision of the evening and the mornings, for it shall be for many days. Which prophecy was this a reference to? This is an explanation of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, where it says, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And if you read what is literally written there by Young's literal translation, it says, and he said unto me, till evening, morning, 2,300. So the vision of the evening and the mornings, the 2,300 days, it was sealed. It means that it couldn't be understood until after 1798. That means that all the explanations before could not be correct either, because this was a vision for many days, and we would see that the people of God would understand this vision. So the question we should ask ourselves, isn't this an important prophecy to understand? Isn't this also a clear mark? Isn't this also a clear mark of who the people of God in the end times will be and what they will understand? That they will understand what it means that the sanctuary would be cleansed and the end of the 2,300 days. The Bible puts a great emphasis on this prophecy. So the question is, when was this open then? Like, what happened when it actually started to be opened? Does the Bible reveal when the book of Daniel was opened? Actually, it does. If you go to Revelation chapter 10, and we'll read there verse 1 and 2, a vision there, and pay attention to the clear connections to Daniel chapter 12. Let us read there, Revelation chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And pay attention to these words here in verse 2. And he had in his hand a little book opened. Doesn't really take on genius to understand if the book was opened, what was the book before? Well, it was closed, right? And this is the only place we read in the Bible when a little book is opened, and the only other place we read about a book being closed or shut up is in book of Daniel chapter 12. So it seems like the book of Daniel, when we clearly prove it very soon in the coming verses here, a book would be opened, and the book of Daniel here would be opened. And he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth. And if we continue later in verse 5, here we can clearly see the connection to Daniel chapter 12, because how does this angel look like and what is his behavior? And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth, he lifted up his hand to heaven and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are therein, and the earth and the things therein, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer, that prophecy would be fulfilled. And Daniel chapter 12 verse 7, we see the very similar characteristics. Again, the angel, he holds up both hands. An obvious question, why is the angel only holding up one hand in Revelation chapter 10 and two hands in Daniel chapter 12? Well, it is because he has a book in one of his hands. So let us read here Daniel chapter 12 verse 7. And I heard a man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, that it shall be for time, times, and half a time. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, and all these things shall be finished. So Revelation chapter 10, the little book that this angel is coming with to John, is actually the message of the 2,300 days which were sealed, right? This was the portion of the book of Daniel that was sealed, and now, after the time of the end, it is time to open it. And what would happen when this book would be opened? Let us see. If you continue in Revelation chapter 10 and verse 8 and 9. And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again and said, Go and take the little book which is opened in the hand of the angel which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And what does John do? And I went unto the angel and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up. And it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. So what does it mean that John had to eat this prophecy, this book? What does it mean? Does the Bible explain what it means to eat a little scroll or a book? In Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 1 to 4, it clearly says what it means when you have to eat a book. So let us read there, Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 1 to 4. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest, eat this roll, and go and speak unto the house of Israel. Here we can see to eat this roll would mean that to speak the words, to give the message which this roll has. And let us continue verse 2. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. I just want to mention, it's not talking about the same roll here, or the same book as in Revelation chapter 10. It's just a similar story, and we're trying to draw a lesson from here. Verse 3. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. Verse 4. And he said unto me, Son of man, go get thee unto the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. So to eat the roll means to assimilate the message and then preach and give it. Here in Ezekiel it says that this message would only be sweet. But what does it say in Revelation chapter 10 and verse 9 and 10? There it says, And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. So we can see a two-part experience of eating this book, this message, these 2,300 days. First, in the mouth, it would be sweet, but later it would turn very bitter. So if we think now of history, and I want to share a little bit of what happened after 1798, when the book of Daniel was about to be understood. And the understanding of these 2,300 days would come. And the history actually begins with a farmer named William Miller. Not really a devout believer of God, basically a deist, believing that God, he had set maybe everything in motion, but didn't really care for his creation. But through different circumstances, the interest for the Bible had gotten awakened in this man's heart, William Miller. And all these questions and perplexities that he had of the Bible before, and all these doubts, and also thinking about the life after death, it's really scared him to think of the nothingness, that this would all that there would be. But eventually he found a friend in the Bible. And he describes it as when he opened the book, he was surprised that a book like this could suit his needs so well. And there must be a God. And he found the bestest and chiefest of friends in Jesus. And he lost all interest in reading all other literature. He only wanted to study the Bible, and he used a concordance comparing verses with verses. And he decided in his mind that I will not go forward longer in the Bible until I understand one verse and understand its meaning of it. So he started in Genesis and went through it, and he would stop when he didn't understand. He would stop, go to the concordance, compare, eventually until the meaning was clear to him. Eventually he got to the book of Daniel, and he was fascinated by the prophecies, and he also saw this clear connection between the prophecy of how the Messiah would come, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and he saw this clear connection between this and the 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. And in his mind, he started to think that what is this a reference to? And he believed that this is talking about the second coming of Jesus, when Jesus would come to the earth and cleanse it with fire, and that Jesus, he was soon to return. He eventually came up to where these 2,300 days would end, and we'll see the experience of the people who also followed him. First, I would like to read a little bit of his own statement. He was a very careful student when it came to the Bible. And he was not some kind of end times doomsday lunatic, because he really wanted the scripture to be put forth as the only rule of truth. Let us read here in William Miller, Apology and Defense, page 13. What he says here is that my great fear was that in their joy at the hope of a glorious inheritance so soon to be revealed, they would receive the doctrine without sufficiently examining the scriptures in demonstration of its truth. I therefore feared to present it, lest by some possibility I should be in error and be the means of misleading any. When he had come to this understanding that the sanctuary would be cleansed after the ending of the 2,300 days, he started to think, but maybe if I'm wrong, maybe I will mislead people. But he went over and over it. And for him, it was very important that the people would not just accept his words, that they would study the history, study the prophecies, and come to the same conclusion. As we will see, that there was something he did misunderstand, and that is that the cleansing of the sanctuary was not a reference to Jesus' second coming, but rather a reference to when the Day of Atonement would start. But this is what he preached. First, he was scared of preaching this message, but he was thinking of the words in Ezekiel. I believe it's in Ezekiel chapter 3 where it says that God tells the watchman to give a warning to his people. And if he doesn't give the warning to the people, he will require their blood upon you. But if you give the message, at least you have delivered your soul. So eventually, William Miller started to preach slowly this message, but it became a great movement. And people started to become excited. And why wouldn't you be excited thinking of that Jesus would soon return, that our earthly wanderings and all our difficulties and hardship would eventually be over, and all our friends would eventually be raised up, and we could be together with the Lord forever. It was a sweet message. And what do you think would happen eventually when they would have preached this sweet message? And I would also like to give an account of one of these persons who were in this movement, who experienced this great revival during the 1830s to 1840s, the Great Advent Awakening, when a great interest of the second coming of Christ had started, because this had died out throughout the Protestantism. They thought that first 1,000 years of peace would come here upon earth, and then Jesus would return. So the interest of Jesus' soon return was not really great, but this message excited a lot of people. It was a sweet message. Let us just read here what Hiram Edson, one of these people who was a part of this great Advent awakening, what he said. They believed that Jesus would eventually come 1844, and particularly on Day of Atonement that year, which was October 22. There he says, "We confidently expected to see Jesus Christ and all the holy angels with him, and that his voice would call up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the ancient worthies, and dear friends which had been torn from us by death, and that our trials and sufferings with our earthly pilgrimage would close, and we should be caught up to meet our coming Lord, to be forever with him, to inhabit bright golden mansions in the golden home city prepared for the redeemed. Our expectations were raised high, and thus we looked for our coming Lord until the clock told 12 at midnight." As you can see here in the first part of this experience here, it is a sweet experience. Can you imagine believing that our earthly wanderings are over soon? Soon we can see all these ancient worthies, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and eventually Jesus himself face to face. It was a sweet message, and it really changed people's lives throughout this time. People were really converted. And before I continue, I just want to remind you of a similar experience. Do you remember the disciples when Jesus entered Jerusalem? When he entered Jerusalem, their expectations were raised high. They were looking forward for Jesus to now finally take the throne of David and vanquish the Romans and be this Messiah, this ruling Messiah. Their expectations were high. But how did it end eventually? The timing was right, because the 70 weeks, the middle of the week, was about to be accomplished. But because they misunderstood the role of the Messiah, there was a great disappointment when eventually the Messiah was crucified and nailed to a cross. It was horrible days, anguish for these disciples. All their hopes were dashed to nothing until Jesus arose, and he actually even explained the scriptures to them. You can read that in Luke chapter 24. And he went back to the Old Testament to prophecy to explain what had happened, and their great disappointment was explained. Something similar would happen eventually when the Day of Atonement would start. There would be a great disappointment, but eventually it would turn into joy. So let us read here again. Let's continue with Hiram Edson and what he says here. So we read that our expectations were raised high, and thus we looked for our coming Lord until the clock told 12 at midnight. But what happened when Jesus didn't come as expected, because they had misunderstood Bible prophecy? Let us read here. The day had then passed, and our disappointments became a certainty. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I have never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. I mused in my own heart, saying, my Advent experience has been the richest and brightest of all my Christian experience. If this had proved a failure, what was the rest of my Christian experience worth? Has the Bible proved a failure? Is there no God, no heaven, no golden home city, no paradise? Is all this but a cunningly devised fable? Is there no reality to our fondest hope and expectation of these things? And thus we had something to grieve and weep over, if all our fond hopes were lost. And as I said, we wept till the day dawned. I want you to understand that these people who had come up to these 2,300 days, yes, they experienced it was very sweet because their lives were transformed. And Hiram Edson here, he clearly says that this was the best experience in his Christian life. And if this had proved to be a failure, what was the rest of it? These were spiritual people who had accepted the message of the 2,300 days and believing that Jesus would come. It was predicted in the Bible that the message or the experience would first be sweet, but then turn into bitterness. It was truly converted Christians who had understood that, yes, Jesus is coming. They were looking forward for this. They had sold their belongings. Their lives have changed. The alcoholics, they had stopped drinking. The abusers of their wives, they had stopped beating them. They had become converted men when they realized that Jesus is coming soon and I need to get my life in order. These people, they were really transformed. They even started to paying off the debts of fellow Christian believers because they didn't want them to have any debts when Jesus would come. They loved Jesus and his coming. So they knew that this was the work of the Holy Spirit, that they could receive this transformation. And what Hiram Edson here points out is, if this experience that Jesus would not come there, and this is what Hiram Edson points out here, that if this had proved a failure, what was the rest of the Christian experience? Was this all just a made-up story and the Bible is not real? So they had something to weep about. Your whole worldview just crushed. But the truth is that they had to recalculate and understand these prophecies because they have seen how clearly all the other prophecies had been fulfilled. So what could be the explanation? Let us read on other person's experience throughout this great disappointment in 1844. It says here, from Washington Morse, the passing of the time was a bitter disappointment. True believers had given up all for Christ and had shared his presence as never before. The love of Jesus filled every soul, and with inexpressible desire they prayed, "Come, Lord Jesus, and come quickly." But he did not come. And now to turn again to the cares, perplexities, and dangers of life, in full view of jeering and reviling unbelievers who scoffed as never before, was a terrible trial of faith and patience. When Elder Himes visited Waterbury, Vermont, a short time after the passing of the time, and stated that the brethren should prepare for another cold winter, my feelings were almost uncontrollable, and I left the place of meeting and wept like a child. We are talking about adult people here who are crying like children because they are crying like children because Jesus did not come. Can you realize how much they loved Jesus and looked forward for him and how their lives were transformed? And let us also read a little bit about William Miller's experience when this great disappointment happened. It passed, and the next day it seemed as though all the demons from the bottomless pit were let loose upon us. The same ones and many more who were crying for mercy 2 days before were now mixed with a rabble and mocking, scoffing, and threatening in a most blasphemous manner. So even people who had been part of this movement, you could see who were the true believers here now, because as soon as Jesus had not come, they were not really looking forward for his coming, because they weren't really weeping and thinking of the great loss of the great loss that he didn't come. Instead, they turned towards these people and started to mock them and revile them in the most blasphemous manner. This was the experience. And again, I want to emphasize that these were true Christians, true believers, who would have to experience what prophecy had predicted. That when the 2,300 days would be opened, the message would first be sweet, it was somewhat misunderstood, and eventually it would become bitter in their belly. It was a similar experience as the disciples had to experience at the Passover, that feast day, when that was misunderstood and Jesus was crucified. A great disappointment. That's how the Christian church started. But eventually we saw also in Daniel that when the 2,300 days would be open in Revelation chapter 10 as well, it says here that in Revelation chapter 10, verse 9 and 10, that it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And because these people who had experienced this great disappointment really loved Jesus, they went back into prophecy to study what have happened. So they had to understand the timing. They checked over and over again the 70 weeks and the 2,300 days, and they see that it ends in that time. So they started to ask the question, could it be that we have misunderstood what it means that the sanctuary would be cleansed? Could it be that we misunderstood Daniel chapter 7 when it says that Jesus would come to the Ancient of Days? That this is not talking about the second coming of Jesus, but the judgment that will start in heaven? So because they loved Jesus, they would not give up their faith. They went back to the Bible. They went back to prophecy to explain the event. Exactly like happened with Jesus. When he rose, instead of just showing himself to the people of Emmaus, he opened the scripture to them and led them back to prophecy to make them understand correctly the mission of the Messiah. And the same when Jesus, he would go from the holy place to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary. This was predicted but misunderstood. And these people started to understand the Bible. They started to understand that, wow, Jesus, in Hebrews chapter 8, it says that he's our heavenly high priest and he's ministering in the true sanctuary. The sanctuary is not the earth, as everybody thought. The sanctuary is in heaven, where Jesus will finish his work, and after he has finished his work of judgment there, he will return and pick up his people. So prophecy explained eventually the great disappointment. Let us continue reading here in Revelation chapter 10, verse 10 and 11, and see how it would continue, this prophecy, when the book of Daniel would be opened, the 2,300 days. First, the message would be sweet, right? Eventually bitter. But what was the next thing that would happen? Let us read verse 10. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and I ate it up. And it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. Describing the experience of those who had started to understand the 2,300 days. First, the message of Jesus soon coming was sweet. When they realized that they got the event wrong, it was very bitter. And then in verse 11, a great prophecy comes. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many people and nations and tongues and kings. Do you see that the message that is said that the hour of God's judgment would come, that it was somewhat misunderstood? That's why they are admonished here in verse 11 to prophesy again, but now with a correct message. And that is what we will be studying in our next episode. What is the true message, the last final call to all the nation, tongues, and kings and peoples? Because we are commanded to prophesy again, and that is a proof that they got the message wrong first, and now they need to give the correct message. So I hope you are looking forward to the next episode when we'll get into what is God's final call to the planet Earth.